So I'm so happy to be back here with you all, with my favorite group of people, the ones whom I enjoy these journeys that we take together. And as you may recall, the last time I was here, I invited suggestions for future courses. And I received a wonderful suggestion from John for a course on orthodoxy and heresy in early Christianity. Doesn't that sound good? Interesting? Now, I have to admit, I have never taught a course on that subject before, just now. But I want to. Now, when you haven't taught a course before, but you want to, what you need is time. Time to prepare. So if you all invite me back in the spring, that will be our topic. Our topic will be orthodoxy and heresy in early Christianity. It's a fascinating subject, and I will get ready for it. Yes. Oh, exactly. Because it's out of that. It's out of that conflict between what became orthodoxy and what was regarded as heresy, that the creeds that we stand and affirm today, it's out of that conflict that the creed arose. So if you invite me back in the spring, Mary, that will be our subject. Now let me tell you about the genesis, the origin of our subject for the fall. I was invited to dinner with Mary and Pete Mentor. And in the course of a beautiful evening and lots of good food and spiritually refreshing conversation, Mr. Mentor shared with me an experience that he had in the hospital, a very life-threatening existential moment. And as he lay there in the hospital, the words of Romans 8, the beautiful climax of that chapter, you know it, nothing can separate us from the love of God in Jesus Christ, neither height nor depth, nor things present, nor things to come, nor angels, nor principalities, nor anything else in all creation can separate us from the love of God in Jesus Christ. Those words came into his heart and mind. And so, on that evening, I resolved that with your help, we would explore Paul's letter to the Romans. Romans is Paul's last and greatest letter. It is his most mature vision of the future of humanity, of what might be possible. It's his vision of reconciliation between people, specifically between Jews and Gentiles. But Paul's vision of ethnic, racial reconciliation in our deeply divided and conflicted world. Right? In fact, I believe that what Paul saw on the horizon as a possibility for human community still defines the agenda for us today. And so it is with that kind of deep yearning to embrace and to continue the vision that Paul had of a reconciled humanity, that we will approach Romans for these 5 weeks. Let me say a word about the broader political, social, cultural context in which Paul wrote this letter. Most scholars would say that Romans was written in the spring of 58 AD. Now, the reason that that day is important is because it is only 8 years before the outbreak of the Great War between Rome and Jerusalem. The war that destroyed the city of Jerusalem, that completely burned to the ground that beautiful temple of God, of which the only thing left standing is the Wailing Wall that you see when you look at a television that shows Jewish people praying in front of monumental stones. That is all that's left of the temple that the Romans destroyed. And to make sure that it would not be rebuilt, the Roman legions desecrated the site. You know how? Anybody? They sacrificed a pig and scattered the bones over the floor of the Jewish temple. Now, 8 years before that terrible event that resulted in the dispersion of Jews driven out of their own city, out of their own country. 8 years before that dramatic event, Paul wrote his great letter to the Romans. I would say he looked through a hole in time. And saw the Holocaust. He saw what might happen if reconciliation was not embraced as the future in the midst. You know, you can feel something coming, can't you? My grandparents told me that in the 1930s, with the rise of fascist dictators in Italy and in Germany, they could feel the war coming. And it came. I don't know about you, but I'm afraid I feel some big conflict coming today. As a new axis forms. Kim Jong-un was where this week? In Russia. They feel for more weapons. They're sending more weapons into the conflict. So I would argue that in the year 58, only 8 years before the outbreak of the Great War that began in 66, that lasted 4 years until 70, politically astute people who had their finger on the pulse, like Paul, I think he saw it coming and tried to stop the wheel from turning with his last and greatest. One more thing about the political and social context. By the year 58, Nero had been emperor for 4 years. In other words, the Mediterranean world, the Roman Empire, was ruled by a sociopath of the worst kind. I can't even recommend to my undergraduates at Fordham that they read The Life of Nero by Suetonius because it is X-rated reading. Yeah, Nero roamed the streets of the city at night, according to Suetonius, with a band of his ruffians, sexually assaulting men and women. He and hierarchy tried to like that. They wanted to Nero fancied himself an artist, right? A singer, a poetess. He composed a poem and sang it while Rome did what? But he was a monster. He murdered his half-brother Britannicus, the natural son of Claudius, so that he could become emperor. He came home from one of his evening carousals, and his wife, reputedly the most beautiful woman in the world at the time, Poppaea Saphina, she was pregnant. And she chastised him for being out carousing all night and kicked her in the stomach. He died and lost the baby. When his mother began to criticize his terrible habits and behaviors, Agrippina was her name. He had the panels above her bedroom loosened so that they would fall on her at night. She survived. He had a party barge that she used. He told sailors to loosen the ropes so that when she boarded the party barge, it would dissolve and capsize in the Bay of Naples. There she swam to shore. So then he ordered a centurion to go to her villa with a gladius, a sword, and kill her. And when, according to Suetonius, when the centurion appeared at the door of Agrippina's bedroom, she pointed at her womb and said, "Strike here first, for this gave birth to Nero." Nero was a sociopath, and he was the most powerful man in the world. Eventually, his enormous spending campaigns, he built a golden house for himself. Does anyone know where it was? Where the Colosseum stands. That was once the Domus Aureus of Nero. They built the Colosseum over after Nero was driven from power. He bankrupted the Roman treasury. Generals from the provinces began to march on Rome. Nero fled and tried to hide in the villa of a friend in the countryside. When they found him, he attempted to commit suicide, but didn't have the courage for it. So he ordered a slave to hold the sword while he drove himself. Well, we think we've known some bad politicians. No one that we have known was as monstrous as Nero, and he had he gave to the sexualized violence that motivated him and that fulfilled his terrible fantasy. He gave to that a gold of popularity. And you can see it corrupting the literature of this period. It became pornographic and violent. Even the art. If I could organize a traveling seminar with all of us from here, I'm serious. We could do it. If we would go to Pompeii, and you would see that the walls of the houses there are painted with motifs that reflect the violence and the sexuality of Nero's life. Okay, this man was the emperor when Paul wrote his great letter to the Romans. And his depravity was already becoming evident because he made a tour of Greece. He toured the places where Paul preached, like Corinth. He made that tour in the company of a young man whom he had taken as his homosexual lover. And he performed at the Greek games, performed on the city, and sang. And of course, who won every contest? At Nemea and at Olympia, Nero won. He had paid applauded, like our politicians today. He had one group of applauders called the bees, because they could make a bee-like sound with their hands, buzzing. He had another group of paid applauders called the roof tiles, because they could make a sound like roof tiles in the wind. The great German Jewish philosopher Jacob Taubes wrote a book on Romans just before he died. He delivered it, Larry, in your own university, as a series of lectures in Heidelberg, sponsored by the great Gunther Born. Just before he died, Taubes was so sick they had to carry him into the lecture hall on a gurney. Propped up on one elbow, he gave his famous lectures which became the book, The Political Theology of Paul. And in the first sentence of that book, Talbot said, Paul's last and greatest letter, the Epistle to the Romans, is a declaration of war on Nero's Rome. Next week, we will examine the evidence for that by looking at the first 2 chapters of Romans, where Paul describes the depravity, the social anomie, the hatred and violence of Nero's Rome. Tragic fall of society into sin. All right, that's enough about the larger political and social context. Not a happy way to begin the day, is it? Yeah. Now let's talk about the situation in Paul's life and work. Paul stands at the end of his great missionary work in the East. And I've passed out some Bibles, and I would like your help in reading Romans chapter 15, verses 14 to 33. And I would like one of you to begin reading, and I'll tell you to stop, right, in order to point out things that are happening in the Greek text that you might not see it. Can you begin reading that for us? Thank you.
I myself feel confident about my brothers and sisters, that you yourselves are full of goodness, filled with all knowledge, and able to instruct one another. Nevertheless, on some points, I have written to you rather boldly by way of reminder, because of the grace given me by God to be a minister of Christ Jesus to the Gentiles in the priestly service of the gospel of God.
Thank you. Stop for just a moment. Perfectly read. Romans is unique within the Pauline corpus because it is the only letter written to a community that Paul himself did not belong. He had never yet been from one. He knows about the community only from hearsay, the reports of others. But now he is preparing to go. And so in the 14 and a half chapters that have preceded the passage that we are reading, Paul lays out systematically his understanding of the gospel. What he takes to be the meaning and the implications of the Christ in it. It is unique in that way among all the letters of Paul. Why does he do it? Because, as we are about to learn, Paul is planning to go through Rome on his way where? Anyone know? Spain. Spain, yes, it would have been called Portugal in those days. He's going to Spain. Spain was not just California. It was the end of the world. As far as the ancients knew, there was nothing beyond the Rock of Gibraltar, which they called the Pillars of Hercules. Nothing beyond that except ocean. And Paul is going to take the gospel about Jesus all the way to the end of the earth, to Spain. But in order to do that, he needs support. Financial support. He needs to be provision on his way. And that is what he's asking Roman Christians to do. He is asking them to become his partners, to underwrite his audacious new mission work in faraway Spain. And in order to persuade them to help, he expounds his whole understanding of the gospel. You're doing such a good job. Will you continue reading?
In Christ Jesus, then, I have reason to boast of my work for God. For I will not venture to speak of anything except what Christ has accomplished through me to win obedience from the Gentiles by word and deed, by the power of signs and wonders, by the power of the Spirit of God, so that from Jerusalem and as far around it as Illyricum, excuse me, I have fully proclaimed the good news of Christ.
All right, stop it. Does anyone know where Illyricum is? Anybody? Illyricum is modern day Albania. Wow. Think of that enormous arc of land that Paul had covered. Without an airplane, without a train, without a car. He claims that he had fully preached the gospel of Christ from Jerusalem all the way around to modern day. Now, surely Paul did not mean that he had evangelized every little what? Hamlet, village, no. His strategy was to plant a little cell of Christ believers in the cities. And then the converts would take it up into the hills and the valleys. And we see that happen, for example, in the Lighthouse Valley, where converts of Paul in Ephesus have taken the message up to Colossae. But did you hear a note of closure in what was just read so beautifully? From Jerusalem around to Illyricum, I have what? Fully preached the gospel of Christ. There's another closure there. Paul stands at the end of his work in the east. Now, what does he mean?
Thus, I make it my ambition to proclaim the good news, not where Christ has already been named, so that I do not build on someone else's foundation, but, as it is written, those who have never been told of him shall see, and those who have never heard of him shall understand.
Right. Evidently, Paul feels that he no longer has room for work in the east. He needs to go to a fresh territory. Now, why is that? Well, students of Paul's previous epistles, First Thessalonians, through the Corinthian correspondence, Galatians, and Philippians, if you read those letters in the order in which Paul probably wrote them, what you encounter is the rising tide of opposition to Paul by Jewish Christians who feared that Paul's message of salvation, not by keeping the works of the law, but by what? Faith, right? By the absolute trust, by the total yes saying of the whole person to God. That's what Paul means by faith. Not just a mental attitude. It's the complete trust in God that Jesus himself exemplified when he said yes in obedience to God's will. It's the faith of Jesus. His faithfulness, his radical obedience, which is now the definition of a right life in the sight of God, not the law. We're still and you can see what a threat that is. If you were a Jew living under Roman rule around the Mediterranean, and you were trying to hang on to your own Jewish identity, you were trying to prop up that identity, how would you do it? You would intensify your commitment to what? The norm of Jewish life. And we're going to see a little bit later this morning that the Jewish Christian apostles who went out from Jerusalem and invaded the territory where Paul had established communities. First, they showed up in Galatia, what is now Turkey. Then we see them in Philippi. Paul warns the Philippians that they are coming. These people who are preaching a gospel of salvation by means of the erga tu non, works of the law. They invaded Paul's communities all across the frontier where he had established. And what they said, you can reconstruct this, what they said from Galatians. They said, Paul has only preached a half gospel. He baptized you, he washed you in water. That's a good beginning. But if you want to advance to a more mature stage in the people of God, you need to do what all the followers of Jesus in Jerusalem and Judea have done. You need to take upon yourself what? The yoke of the faith. Jesus himself was what? A Jew. And obedient to the Jew. So that's what they argued against Paul. And I would say that in the verses that you just read for us so well, when Paul says, I no longer have room for work in these regions, I think it's because the ground underneath his feet has become what? Too hot, too slippery. Paul feels like he's being run out of the east by the Jewish Christian apostles who have said Paul is not legitimate and his gospel is the devil. Now, what about you? How do you feel when your ideas are opposed, resisted, rejected? My proposals are criticized and rejected in the faculty where I teach, whether it's at United Seminary here or less so, but still perhaps at Fordham. I become depressed. I'm tempted to give up, to sit down. One of the things that inspires me most about Paul, in the face of that rising opposition, what's he going to do? Go to Spain and start again. This late Paul at the end of his work, I love so much. Did you all see the movie that Sir Richard Attenborough made of the life of God? Oh, you should see it. Go to Netflix. It's just called Gandhi. It's so inspiring. And as you may know, at the end of Gandhi's life, India, whose freedom and self-determination he had fought so hard for, had gone on hunger strikes, had led marches like the Thought March. India and Pakistan were dissolved in racial violence, civil war. And in the midst of that, you'll see it in the film, a reporter for the BBC comes to Gandhi and puts a microphone in front of his face and says, Mr. Gandhi, look, the country is dissolving all around you. Don't you think maybe your work has been failed? Watch the movie, you'll see Gandhi responded by saying no. I will go to Pakistan. Paul was not going to do that. He was going to go to Spain. Now, would you keep reading?
This is the reason that I have so often been hindered from coming to you. But now, with no further place for me in these regions.
Did you hear that? No further place for me. He's being pushed out, right? The ground is too hot. It's too slippery.
With no further place for me in these regions, I desire, as I have for many years, to come to you when I go to Spain. For I do hope to see you on my journey and to be sent on by you once I have enjoyed your company for a little while.
Thank you. Stop for just a minute. Say this long Greek verb with me, propimpestai. Propimpestai. That's the verb. And on my way back. When you look that up, Larry, in the Greek dictionary, you know what it means? It means to be equipped with provisions, to be sent forward with provisions and financial support. You can't see that in the English, can you? But it's clear in the Greek. Paul is asking the Romans to equip him, to provision him, to send him forward for this ambitious new mission work he's going to begin in Spain. Now, in what you read, I want, excuse me, hey, Steve, apologies to the people watching online. In what you just read, did you hear that Paul says he has longed for some time to visit Rome, but until now he feels that he's been hindered? Now, can you draw the inference? If Paul has been wanting to go to Rome for a long time to see the Christ followers, what does that say about the Roman church? Yes, and it has been there for a while, right? It's been there. We'll talk a little more about that in just a minute. Now, keep reading.
At present, however, I'm going to Jerusalem in ministry to the saints. Macedonia and Achaia have been pleased to share their resources for among the saints at Jerusalem. They were pleased to do this, and indeed they owe it to them. For if the Gentiles have come to share in their spiritual blessings, they ought also to be of service to them in material things.
Now, wait a minute. The last time I looked at the map, I know I'm not the best map reader, but I can tell you how many times we've been lost. But the last time I looked at the map, Jerusalem is not on the way where? To Spain or to Rome. It's in the opposite direction. Why is Paul going there? Well, he explains it. For 14 years, Paul had invested himself in raising a collection, raising money among his Gentile churches to give to the poor saints in Jerusalem. Now, this began as a charitable endeavor, but as the years passed and Paul invested himself in it, it took on a deeper meaning. If you trace the references to the collection through Paul's letters, you will see that for Paul, this contribution of financial support became the embodiment in Paul's heart and mind of the unity of the Christian movement out of Jews and Gentiles. By the way, I have a good friend, Professor John Kloppenborg in Toronto, who has spent the last 20 years investing himself in the study of ancient religious association. And what he has discovered is that there is no parallel in other religious associations of the period to Paul's attempt to build an international and ecumenical framework for members of a religion. This is a new thing in this. Paul is trying, and it has enormous implications because remember, the Great War is what? 8 years away. And Paul is trying to bring Gentile believers together with Jewish believers into one church. Larry, you were probably a student in Germany when the great Oscar Kuhlmann, Lutheran, who taught in Switzerland, he tried to revive Paul's ecumenical mission by proposing that on Reformation Sunday, Catholics collect money for Protestant churches and Protestant churches collect money for poor Catholics. That's an amazing idea. He was trying to revive Paul's project of an ecumenical collection as a way forward into the future of reconciliation. All right, keep reading. Look how much we're getting out of this one little passage, right? In reconstructing the situation in Paul's life and work.
So when I have completed this and have delivered to them what has been collected, I will set out by way of you to Spain. I know that when I come to you, I will come in the fullness of the blessing of Christ. I appeal to you, brothers and sisters, by our Lord Jesus Christ and by the love of the Spirit.
Now, wait just a minute. Here it comes. Paul is about to make a request of the Romans. He's about to appeal to them to do something for them. He wants them to do two things. You keep reading.
Join me in earnest prayer to God on my behalf, that I may be rescued from the unbelievers in Judea.
Stop for a minute. Wow. Appeal to God on my behalf, that I may be what? From the unbelievers. Do you think Paul had reason to suspect that in going to Jerusalem, his life would be in what?
Same idea of sharing.
Aha, did you hear that? But actually, John, you're ahead of me. Read the next one. Sorry. Will you read the next verse?
And ministry to Jerusalem may be acceptable to the saints, so that by God's will I may come to you with joy and be refreshed in your company.
What? Do you mean to say Paul also had reason to fear that the collection that he had been raising for the poor Jewish Christians might be what? Rejected. Pray with me that it will be accepted to the saints. Was it rejected? The author of the book of Acts is ominously silent about the fate. He knows that Paul got to Jerusalem with the money. He reports that. He refuses to say what happened. Along with scholars like one of my mentors, a German New Testament scholar at Harvard, Helmut Kester, I think the silence of Acts about the fate of the collection is devastating. It speaks volumes. I think the Jewish Christians, the leaders of the church in Jerusalem, I think they refuse to accept Paul's collection. You know why? They viewed, yes, John. They viewed it as tainted. It came from uncircumcised Gentiles who were not keeping the law. Now, those of you that know the history of the foundation of the state of Israel, when refugees from the Holocaust were attempting to carve out a state, the state of Israel in Palestine, a super wealthy family of French Jews, whose name is associated with wine, the Rothschild, offered Ben Gurion, one of the first prime ministers, a large donation to organize a new state, state of Israel. You know what Ben Gurion said? No, he didn't. Why? Because the Rothschilds during the Nazi occupation had been what? How do they know all those beautiful vineyards that we enjoy today? So Paul fears two things and asks the Romans to pray for him, that he will be delivered from the unbelievers in Judea. He knew that his life was in danger. And that the collection that he had been raising for the poor would be found. Do you mean to say that in the face of these great dangers, Paul persevered? He went on into them. That's the Paul that I love best of all, right? The Paul who had come to know his fate and who had the courage to choose. His solidarity with this vision of a reconciled humanity, Jews and Gentiles. In the end, his solidarity with that vision went so deep and so far that he risked his own life. myself. It still inspires me to know that he didn't give up. Kept going, even in the face of this kind of knowledge. Did we get all the way to the end of verse 33? Maybe we did.
Yes.
Go ahead. See, the danger is when I'm so passionately involved, as I am with this, that I will run over time. Where are we?
9:41.
Which means
Yes, 19.
good, just enough time. Now, in Paul's effort, he finds that he discovers, and we will look in a few minutes at the passage that demonstrates. Paul discovers that his opponents and critics, the Jewish Christian apostles that invaded his churches in Galatia and in Macedonia, guess what? They have beaten him to Rome. They have preceded him to Rome, and they are spreading what Paul regards as slander. They are misrepresenting Paul's gospel to the Romans. And that's one of the big reasons why Paul feels that he has to unfold his entire understanding, because he thinks he's been misrepresented. We will look at those passages. We've talked about the situation on the global political scale. We've talked about the situation in Paul's life when he wrote this letter. Now, last of all, we need to talk about the Roman church, the Christ groups that have formed in the city of Rome by the year 58 in the first century. One of my Heidelberg colleagues, Larry, a good friend named Pater Lampa, wrote an important book about 20 years ago, published by Fortress Press, called The Christians of Rome in the First Two Centuries. And in that book, he did what someone should have done a long time. He synthesized the literature with archaeology. There is archaeological evidence for Christians at Rome at the early period. He found that there are 5 titular churches. That is to say, 5 churches that bear the names of early Christians and whose history can be traced. He was able archaeologically to locate these 5 Christ groups, and guess where they were? They were concentrated in 2 areas. The first area is Trastevere. Has anyone been to Trastevere? Have you been to the Vatican? Yeah, that's where it was. On the wrong side, just over the Tiber River. In the first century, it was not a beautiful neighborhood like the one that you visit today, where you can have a good cup of coffee and some pasta. In the first century, it was the dock. It was the harbor. It's where the boats came in and unloaded as they sailed up the Tiber River. And it was a ghetto. It was populated mostly by immigrants. Syrian, Egyptian, Jews. That's where Pater Lampa traced an early concentration of Christ followers. A second neighborhood, beyond the Porta Capena, the gate, the Porta Capena, on the Appian Way. When you were in Rome, did you walk the Appian Way? If you go out just beyond the legal boundary of Rome, just beyond the Pomerium, you are in the area where Lampa discovered a concentration of Christ groups. Just like Trastevere, it was a poor neighborhood. How did Jewish Christians get out there? Well, the truth is, we do not know how the message about Jesus came to Rome. Our Catholic colleagues and friends, my bosses at Fordham, argue that Peter brought the gospel to Rome. First pope. There's no evidence. No early and indisputable evidence. The gospel was probably brought to Rome by anonymous Christians who were Passover pilgrims to Jerusalem. The book of Acts lists the Jews who were there for Passover on the day of, who would stay for the day of Pentecost, right? When the Holy Spirit entered into the apostles and they began to speak in all these languages. And among those Jews from across the Mediterranean who were there for that event, the author of Acts says there were some. So it was probably one of those Passover pilgrims who took the gospel back to the city of Rome. Now, a dramatic event occurred for the Christians, in fact, two events in this period. First of all, in the year 41 AD, Claudius became emperor. Caligula had been assassinated. They found Claudius, a middle-aged man, hiding behind a curtain in the palace, and the soldiers took him out to the military camp and declared him emperor. Well, Suetonius, who not only wrote the life of Nero, he also wrote a life of Claudius. And Suetonius tells us that among the first things that Claudius did when he became emperor in 4041, Suetonius says, I want you to hear the Latin text. Latin students, you can translate it. Deus, impulsore Christo. At the impulse or instigation of who? Christ. Assiduae tumultuantes. Assiduae is what? Assiduously, continuously, tumultuantes. Making a tumult. Rioting. Roma expelled. He expelled them. He expelled them from Rome. Put it all together. In the first year of his reign, in the Jewish community at Rome, there were constant, regular upheavals, riots, tumults about the identity of whom? Christ. Who is the Christ? And here's how Claudius dealt with it. Roma expelled. He expelled the Jews from Rome. Wow. According to the book of Acts, chapter 18, Acts chapter 18, verse 3 to 5, when Paul arrived in Corinth for the first time, he found lodging and a livelihood with two Jewish Christians. You remember their names? Aquila and Priscilla. Diane has a colleague in the office. Happy to know that she has an early Christian. According to Acts, when Paul came to Corinth, he found lodging with this Jewish couple, Christian couple, who had lately come to Corinth from Italy because, Luke says, Claudius had commanded all the Jews. Suetonius and the book of Acts agree exactly. Now, what we have learned from archaeologists like Hager Lampa is that the majority of the Jews, including the Jewish Christians, did not go all the way way across the Mediterranean to Florida in order to settle. Most of them simply did what? Moved beyond the legal boundary of the city of Rome, so-called area, shut up and set up houses and shopkeepers. And that's why we find concentrations of Jews and Jewish Christians where? Out on the Appian Way, beyond the gate, and across the Tiber River in Trastevere. Now, Claudius, who became emperor in the year 4041, he was poisoned with his favorite food. Anyone know what it was? Mushrooms. He was poisoned with a mushroom by whom? Can you guess? Nero. And Nero's mother, the Lady Macbeth of Roman history, Agrippina. They poisoned Claudius. And that wasn't a happy event, I'm sure, for Claudius. Although the Senate voted to deal on him. So probably on deathbed he thought, I'm becoming a god. But for the Jews of Rome, the death of Claudius, at first anyway, was good. Because now with Claudius dead, guess what they did? They moved back into the city of Rome in great numbers. How many? Edgar Lampa estimates, listen to this, that by the end of the first century, there were probably 60,000 Jews living in Rome. The total population of the city of Rome was just over 1 million. Did you realize that until London in the 19th century, no city in the world had over 1 million. Rome was the largest city in history until London in the 19th century. And 60,000 of them or so were Jews. Now, can you put all of this together? If there had been Christ followers living inside the city of Rome from the year 40 until the year 54, they would not have been who? Jews. Because they had been what? Pushed out. They'd been expelled. They would have been Gentile Christ believers. But after the year 54, the Jews come back into the city in great numbers. So that, can you figure this out? By the year 58, when Paul writes his great letter to the Romans, the Christian church in Rome is what? Mixed. It is ethnically, religiously, Gentile Christians and Jewish. And the evidence of tension between these two groups, right? Conflicting norms, practices, values. The evidence is all over the last few chapters of Romans. Can I show you? So if you turn to Romans chapter 14, verse 1, just before the passage that we read, from 14:1 down to 15:13, Paul deals with conflicts within the Roman church. There are two parties, two groups. He refers to one group as the strong. He refers to the other group as the weak, people who are weak in confidence. So look at chapter 14, verse 2. Can somebody read that for us? 14:2. We have a good friend here in Dayton, a former Jewish rabbi, Bernard Barsky. Do you know him? I don't think he's been here for maybe not. It would have been years ago when he was still alive. He's retired now. He became our close friend. We invited him for dinner on a number of occasions. But he was a conservative Jew, not Orthodox, but conservative. And on those occasions when he came to eat at our table, guess what we ate that night? Only vegetables. was hallucinatory. The fish we had at your house, but it was so good that I honestly and I followed it. Hallucinatory reading. Okay, there's one group in the Church of Rome that thinks they can eat it. Who would they be? Gentiles like me eating that barbecue pork and those shrimp. I'm gonna go home at lunch and have that shell. Would someone read chapter 14, verse 5? 14:5. Go ahead. Right, it would always be. What day is better than others in the week? Shabbat, the Sabbath, right? And other holy days like Rosh Hashanah, which we just celebrated at the beginning of the new year. Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement. Again, the difference, the conflict, is between Jews and Gentiles. Would somebody read chapter 14, verse 14? 14:14.
I know and am persuaded in the Lord Jesus that nothing is unclean in itself, but it is unclean for anyone who thinks it unclean.
See, again, some people are observing kosher food. Kashrut, kosher food, it restricts the diet to things which, according to the book of Leviticus, are what? And now finally, we don't have the time to do it, but if you read chapter 15, verses 7 through 13, you will see that underneath all of this, the most fundamental distinction within the Roman Church is between the circumcised and the uncircumcised. So when Paul writes this last and great letter to the Romans, he writes it to a community that is ethnically and conflicted. And the tensions can be felt all the way through the letter. In fact, we will explore it when we come back to it. Unfortunately, I've run out of my time. People are holding clocks up at me. Questions? Would you please, the things that you have my life over the years have actually impacted and enriched my story. And as you, I'm so grateful because, what we really need to do, biblical scholars like me, historians, my agenda is to grasp the connection that previous moment, which so how does that relate to our present? It's that connection. And Larry, you helped me grasp it. As you all are going on your way today, and this illustrates how you all, your comments, your suggestions, how you have enriched my teaching and my scholarship in an act of shameless self-promotion. I've just published a new book. Fortress Press, here it is. And so I'm gonna pass it around for you as you're leaving. It's called That There May Be Equality. Here's what it's about. Paul's collection. Or the subtitle, Paul's Appeal for Partnership in the collection. Okay, thank you all so much. If I can persuade you to come back next week, we will begin entering into the argument of Paul's exposition of the gospel. Today we focused on what? Situation. Right? So now we know the situation. In the great world, in Paul's own life, and in the Roman church. Yes, Harry.
As we listen to you, it just entered my mind that it would be like Paul talking to the Romans for the Roman group of them, emphasizing that all the church doing today.
Yeah.
But this is just all right.
That's right. Thank you. How would that work? How would Paul place it to a community? Yes. At the end of Romans chapter 16, verses 1 and 2, Paul tells the Romans that he is sending them a woman named Phoebe. We met her a few weeks ago. Phoebe of Cenchrea, the patroness of Paul and others, whose house church was in Cenchrea on the west. Harry, I believe it was Phoebe who carried Paul's word to the Roman Christians and who read it out in the assembly. That argument is made by my great old friend, passed away recently, Robert Jewett, in his big commentary, 1,000-page commentary on Romans for the Hermeneutics series that Jewett told me one time cost him 47 years and 2 minutes. I'll see you next week. Please come back.